to Constitution Hall Pass. I'm Victoria Chow, here at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. This December 6th marks a major anniversary for the U.S. Constitution, the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. In celebration of this occasion, we're going to explore the 13th Amendment and how it changed our nation. The 13th Amendment was adopted just a few months after the end of the Civil War. This period in American history is called the Reconstruction Era because it literally was the time when our country was being rebuilt. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added between 1865 and 1870 with this goal of rebuilding in mind. But to some extent, they're still being worked out today. In this episode, we'll take a closer look at the 13th Amendment. But to do that, we have to go back to the beginning. Let's check in with our constitutional correspondent, Joe Penn.
Our story begins at the Constitutional Convention, where slavery first became a matter of national debate. This room, Signers Hall, contains 42 life-size statues showing the moment of the signing of the Constitution. At this convention, delegates from different states faced many challenges in trying to fix the problems with the Articles of Confederation and to form a more perfect union. One of the biggest challenges that they faced? The issue of slavery. The delegates had different views about slavery. Some of the founders said that the institution of slavery was bad for the morality of society. Gouverneur Morse from Pennsylvania at one time called slavery a curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. But some of the delegates weren't willing to agree to the Constitution if slavery was prohibited. They wanted to leave the matter up to the states, so that the southern states could hold on to their slaves, while the northern states could choose to abolish slavery. The delegates also had to decide how enslaved persons were to be counted as part of a state's population, which determined the number of seats a state had in the House of Representatives and taxes levied on states by the federal government. So the delegates compromised on the issue of representation by creating the 3/5 Compromise. The compromise stated that, for purpose of taxation and representation, every enslaved person in the United States would count as 3/5 of a free person. And the word slavery isn't even included in the Constitution that was signed in 1787. Think about it like this. The issue of slavery was left unresolved. It wasn't extinguished. It smoldered for years before exploding in the Civil War.
Thanks, Joe. From the ratification of the Constitution and for the next 80 years, the debate over slavery became increasingly heated. Some states were ending slavery on their own, and some states were embracing it. But as the nation expanded westward, it faced an important question. Would the new territories become slave states or free states? The answer to that question would have a big effect on how much representation the slave states would have in Congress compared to the free states. To try to keep the peace between the two sides, Congress enacted a series of compromises in the years before the war. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise drew a clear dividing line on our map, saying that slavery would be banned in any new states that were north of parallel 36 degrees and 30 minutes north. Another significant compromise in 1850 tried to make some concessions to the slave states after the admission of California as a free state tipped the balance between the two sides. But the gap between the two sides continued to widen. Many Northerners were angry at the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Law that required law enforcement officers everywhere to assist in capturing and returning fugitive slaves. Several northern states believed they didn't have to abide by the Fugitive Slave Law. By 1856, you could see the divide between North and South in the presidential election, when James Buchanan carried every single state in the South, and a few northern ones too. Throughout it all, while politicians feuded over the issue of slavery, leading abolitionists carried their message to the people using pulpits, platforms, and pens to reach their audiences. Figures like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Harriet Beecher Stowe made sure that the voices of American citizens were heard in the ongoing debate. Others, like Nat Turner in Virginia and John Brown in Kansas, resorted to violence to eradicate slavery. Things were changing on the political scene as well. For one thing, the Republican Party was founded in 1854, largely based on opposition to slavery and the position that Congress could abolish slavery in the new territories. However, this forward momentum came to a halt in 1857 with a Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott versus Sandford. It's widely regarded as the Supreme Court's worst mistake ever. The court ruled that it was unconstitutional for the federal government to interfere with the rights of slaveholders, and that African Americans were not, nor ever could be, citizens of the United States. This decision made it impossible for the issue of slavery to be resolved through the political process. The only way to undo the decision and to get rid of slavery once and for all would be to change the Constitution through an amendment, which again would have been nearly impossible at that time. Tensions continued to build between North and South. The final straw came when Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the first president from the Republican Party. Although Lincoln tried to reassure the slave states that he wouldn't try to bring an immediate end to slavery, they didn't believe him. One by one, they seceded from the Union, announcing that they were no longer part of the United States of America. They organized themselves into the Confederate States of America and claimed that they were an independent country. But was secession allowed under the Constitution? Lincoln and a majority of Northerners said no. The issue of slavery had forced a crisis over the very nature of the Constitution. Tensions grew until on April 12, 1861, the South Carolina militia fired on U.S. defenses at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. This marked the beginning of the bloodiest conflict ever waged on U.S. soil, the Civil War. The Civil War raged on until 1865. Americans fought each other with rifles, cannon, bayonets, and their bare fists, and they died by the thousands. Civilians, especially in the South, saw their homes, farms, and cities wrecked by the relentless march of troops. As the war continued, the Union realized that the conflict would never really end without the final end of slavery, not just at the state level, but at the federal level too. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free, and that African Americans would be permitted to serve in the Union military. The Union finally triumphed in 1865, settling the question of the South's secession. But the work of ending slavery was far from over. At the end of the war, we had a country that had been ripped apart, with brothers literally fighting against brothers. Many people, especially in the North, felt that if slavery were allowed to continue in any part of the United States, it could lead to another war. These people figured that an amendment to the Constitution would be the only way to end slavery, because it would guarantee that slavery could not be reestablished in any state or territory. It would also end slavery in those states not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. See? It's Article 5 of the Constitution that tells us how we can change or amend the Constitution. Amendments can be introduced by national constitutional conventions or by votes of Congress. Once 2/3 of both houses of Congress approve a proposed amendment, it clears the first hurdle. But it isn't a part of the Constitution quite yet. 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment for it to go into effect as part of the Constitution. The Senate passed a proposed amendment banning slavery in April 1864. The amendment initially failed to pass in the House of Representatives, but in November 1864, Lincoln won re-election, with a clear majority of the Union's voters approving of his anti-slavery platform. After Lincoln's re-election in January 1865, the House of Representatives passed the amendment. Then it was sent to the states for ratification. When Georgia ratified it on December 6, 1865, it officially became a part of the Constitution of the United States. Let's look quickly at what it says. The 13th Amendment says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. But it doesn't stop there. It takes it a step further and says that Congress can pass laws to make sure that the ban on slavery is upheld. The 13th Amendment was eventually accompanied by two other amendments in the Reconstruction era, designed to establish African American civil rights. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, directly overruled the Dred Scott decision and extended citizenship to every person born or naturalized as citizens within the United States, prohibited states from denying any person the privileges and immunities of citizenship or equal protection of the laws, and prohibited states from denying any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, said that no one could be denied the right to vote based on their race, color, or prior condition of servitude. These three amendments are often grouped together as the Reconstruction Amendments. But Reconstruction went beyond these amendments. For 12 years after the Civil War, Congress kept military control over the southern states. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau, which was authorized to administer the new laws and help freed slaves obtain food, shelter, and land, as well as other economic, civil, educational, and political resources. African Americans participated in state and federal government for the first time. In 1870, Hiram Rhodes Revels became the first African American member of the United States Senate, representing the state of Mississippi. But Southerners did not like the federal government sending in troops to reorganize their state governments, and some of them banded together to resist Reconstruction. By 1877, the era of Reconstruction had sputtered to a close. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were still part of the Constitution, and they could still be used to protect freedom. The Supreme Court has long held that in addition to prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude, the 13th Amendment allows Congress to pass laws to eradicate the badges and incidents of slavery. The Supreme Court has never defined the full scope of what the badges and incidents of slavery are. Instead, they've left it to Congress to flesh out a definition. But this is a large power given to Congress to ensure that slavery by any name would never be allowed. By the middle of the 20th century, African Americans still face discrimination in jobs, housing, and many other areas of life. Having fought for decades in the courts, in this period, the civil rights movement in the United States roared into gear and became a mass grassroots movement. Think of the heroes we remember from the civil rights movement of the late 1950s and 1960s. Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, and so many others. During the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, alongside acts of nonviolent protest and peaceful assembly, African Americans relied on the Constitution, including the 13th Amendment, and the courts to assert and protect previously denied civil rights. In 1965, a full century after the end of the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, Joseph Lee and Barbara Jones were looking for their dream home. They found what they were looking for in a newly constructed home in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri. But after making their offer, they were told they were not allowed to buy the house. The construction company would not allow any of their homes to be purchased by African Americans. So Jones took his case to court. Jones argued that the construction company's refusal to sell him the home because of his race violated a federal law which declared that all people in every state and territory have the same right to purchase and sell real estate regardless of race or color. The case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where in 1968, the court ruled in Jones versus Alfred H. Mayer Company that Congress had the power to pass a law prohibiting private discrimination in the sale of housing because housing discrimination was one of the badges and incidents of slavery. And while housing discrimination remains a problem in many areas across the country, the court declared that the 13th Amendment is as vital a part of the Constitution as it had ever been before. Most recently, Congress has determined that the 13th Amendment provides a basis for a portion of a law that criminalizes race-based hate crimes, as well as a law that penalizes human trafficking and protects its survivors. The Supreme Court has yet to evaluate the constitutionality of these laws and decide whether they're permissible exercises of 13th Amendment power. Some people say that acts of violence, like hate crimes, are not the same as slavery or involuntary servitude and should not be covered by the 13th Amendment. Others argue that hate crimes and private housing discrimination are similar to the oppression of slavery, and Congress therefore has the power to make laws to prevent them under the 13th Amendment. The debate continues, just like it does with the Constitution as a whole. That's what the Constitution is really all about. It's the instruction manual for our nation, but it takes constant work to figure out what those instructions mean. Interpreting how the Constitution applies to new and changing conditions is an ongoing process. It's up to everyday citizens like you and me to bring our grievances to the larger public, the press, and the courts. It's these basic rights of grievance and dissent that allow us to build a more perfect union. From the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, I'm Victoria Chow. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Constitution Hall Pass.